The amber glow of flames licked the sky as Mason Alden pulled back on the reins of his stallion, the scent of burning wood and destruction filling his nostrils on that cool, autumn evening of 1875. He'd seen the smoke rising above the trees miles back and had ridden hard toward it, hoping he wasn't too late to help whoever might be in danger. Mason was no stranger to tragedy in the Montana Territory. At 28, he'd spent most of his adult life moving from ranch to ranch, breaking horses and driving cattle. The life of a cowboy suited him: open skies, honest work, and minimal complications. People called him a loner, but he preferred the term self-sufficient. He kept his past tucked away like the worn photograph of his parents he carried in his saddlebag, rarely mentioned and seldom examined. The burning homestead had nearly collapsed in on itself, flames dancing wildly as Mason circled the property. No one could still be alive in there. He was about to turn away when a movement caught his eye: a figure staggering from behind what remained of a barn, away from the main house. "Hello," he called out, dismounting in one fluid motion. "Are you hurt?" As he approached, he saw it was a young woman. Her dress was torn and blackened with soot, her face smudged with ash. She limped heavily, clutching her right side, her eyes wide with shock and pain. She couldn't have been more than 22 or 23 years old. "Stay back," she warned, her voice hoarse from smoke. She stumbled, nearly falling. Mason closed the distance between them. "Madam, you need help. I'm not here to harm you." Her legs gave out just as he reached her. He caught her before she hit the ground, her body trembling against his. "My family," she whispered, trying to look back at the inferno. "There, SHH," Mason said, his heart sinking. He could tell by the intensity of the blaze that anyone inside was beyond saving. "Don't think about that now. Let me help you." The night air was growing colder, and she wore only a thin, damaged dress. Without hesitation, Mason shrugged off his heavy leather duster coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. It swallowed her small frame but would keep her warm. "What's your name?" he asked gently, supporting her weight. "Julia," she replied, her voice barely audible. "Julia Fairchild." "I'm Mason Alden." He glanced at her injured leg. "Can you ride?" When she nodded weakly, Mason lifted her onto his horse, then mounted behind her. He cradled her against his chest, one arm securely around her waist while the other held the reins. She was still shaking, whether from shock or cold, he couldn't tell. All he knew was that this woman needed protection, and something inside him had already decided he wouldn't let her go until she was safe. As they rode away from the burning homestead, Julia Fairchild slipped into unconsciousness, her head resting against Mason's shoulder. He urged his horse forward, toward the small town of Pinewood Creek, where he knew the doctor would still be awake despite the late hour. What Mason didn't realize as they disappeared into the darkness was that his life had just changed forever. The coat he'd wrapped around Julia's shoulders was just the beginning of what he would give her. The town of Pinewood Creek was mostly silent as Mason rode in with Julia still unconscious in his arms. Only the saloon showed signs of life, piano music drifting into the street along with raucous laughter. Mason headed straight for Doc Miller's house at the end of Main Street. He dismounted carefully, keeping Julia secure in his arms. Her face was pressed against his chest, her breathing shallow but steady. The weight of her in his arms felt strangely right, as if he'd been meant to find her. Mason pushed the thought aside he had more pressing concerns. He kicked at the door with his boot, and moments later a light appeared in the window. Doc Miller opened the door, his gray hair disheveled, spectacles perched on the end of his nose. "Mason, what in tarnation?" His eyes fell on Julia. "Bring her in, quickly." Mason carried her into the examination room and gently laid her on the table as directed. "What happened?" Doc asked, already checking her pulse. Found her limping away from a burning homestead about 7 miles east. Place was nearly gone when I got there. Mason stepped back but couldn't take his eyes off her. I think she might be the only survivor. Doc Miller nodded grimly. The Fairchild place. Heard they were having trouble with some land grabbers. He began examining Julia's leg. She's got some burns, nothing too severe. This ankle's badly sprained, though, and she's breathed in a fair amount of smoke. Will she be all right? Mason asked, his voice betraying more concern than he intended. Doc Miller glanced up with a knowing look. With proper care, yes. But she's going to need somewhere to stay, someone to look after her. She can stay with me, Mason said without hesitation. I've got that cabin up by Silver Creek. Doc Miller raised an eyebrow. That's mighty generous for a man who usually keeps to himself. Mason shifted uncomfortably. Just seems like the right thing to do is all. The doctor didn't press further. Help me get her cleaned up. I'll need to dress these burns and wrap that ankle. Together they worked to tend to Julia's injuries. Mason held her upright while Doc Miller checked her breathing, then helped clean the soot from her face. In the lamplight, he could see her features clearly for the first time: high cheekbones, a small nose, and full lips slightly parted as she breathed. Her hair, freed from its pins, fell in long auburn waves. As they worked, Julia stirred, her eyes fluttering open. For a moment confusion clouded her face, then panic. "Where am I?" she gasped, trying to sit up. "The fire, easy now," Mason said, gently placing his hand on her shoulder. "You're safe. This is Doc Miller. We're in Pinewood Creek." Recognition dawned in her eyes as she looked at Mason. You helped me," he nodded. "Found you at your homestead." The memory seemed to hit her all at once. Her face crumpled and she covered her mouth with her hand. "My parents. My brother." Doc Miller and Mason exchanged a solemn glance. "I'm so sorry, Miss Fairchild," the doctor said softly. "Was anyone else in the house?" Julia shook her head, tears streaming down her ash-stained cheeks. "Just us. My father sent me to check on the horses when we heard riders approaching. Then there was shouting and gunshots." She squeezed her eyes shut. "They set the house on fire. I was hiding in the barn when it caught too." Mason's jaw tightened. "Did you see who did it?" "3 men. One had a scar across his cheek. Another wore a black hat with a silver band." She looked up at Mason, her green eyes fierce despite her tears. "Maddox's men. They've been trying to force us off our land for months." "Victor Maddox?" Doc Miller asked, his expression grave. "He's been buying up half the county and burning out those who won't sell," Julia said bitterly. Mason knew of Maddox, a cattle baron with a reputation for ruthlessness. The law in these parts was too sparse and too easily bought to offer much protection against men like him. "You need rest," Doc Miller said, finishing the bandage on her ankle, "and you're welcome to stay here tonight." "No," Mason interrupted. "Maddox has men in town if they find out she survived." He left the implication hanging. "My cabin's remote. She'll be safer there until we figure out what to do." Julia looked between them, then at Mason. "I don't even know you." "Name's Mason Alden. I break horses for the Wilcox Ranch, but I've got my own place. It's not much, but it's secure." He met her gaze steadily. "I promise you'll be safe there, Miss Fairchild." Something in his voice must have reassured her, because after a moment she nodded. "All right, Mr. Alden. It seems I don't have much choice." Doc Miller packed a bag with bandages and medicines, instructing Mason on how to care for Julia's injuries. "Keep that ankle elevated. The burns need to be cleaned and dressed daily, and watch for any fever or coughing. Lung fever can set in after breathing smoke." As Mason prepared to leave, Julia insisted on trying to walk. "You shouldn't put weight on that ankle," he protested. "I won't be carried like a child," she said firmly, though her voice wavered. Mason recognized the pride in her stance. It was something he understood all too well. How about a compromise? He offered his arm for support. With Doc Miller's help, Julia stood, still wrapped in Mason's coat which hung almost to her ankles. She leaned heavily on Mason as they made their way outside. The night had grown colder, and Julia shivered despite the coat. Getting her on the horse proved challenging with her injuries, but Mason was patient, supporting her weight and helping her settle in the saddle before mounting behind her. "Thank you, Doctor," Julia said. "Come see me in a week if you can," Doc Miller replied. "And Mason," he fixed the cowboy with a stern look, "take good care of her." Mason nodded solemnly. "You have my word." As they rode out of town, Julia sat rigid in front of him, clearly fighting to stay conscious. After a few minutes, exhaustion won out and she leaned back against his chest. Mason adjusted his hold, keeping her secure as they traveled the moonlit trail toward his cabin. The rhythm of the horse's hooves and the warmth of the man behind her lulled Julia into a state between wakefulness and sleep. Her mind kept replaying the horrors she'd witnessed, but whenever the memories became too vivid, the solid presence of Mason Alden would bring her back to the present. She didn't know this man who had found her in her darkest moment, who had wrapped her in his coat and was now taking her to his home. Yet something told her she could trust him. Perhaps it was the gentleness in his calloused hands as he'd helped her, or the unwavering resolve in his blue eyes when he promised to keep her safe. Whatever tomorrow would bring, tonight she was alive, and for now, that would have to be enough. Mason's cabin sat nestled among a stand of pines near Silver Creek, about 4 miles from town. It was small but sturdy, built with his own hands over the course of 2 summers. The location offered privacy and a good view of the approaching trail, exactly what they needed now. By the time they arrived, the first hint of dawn was lightening the eastern sky. Julia had fallen into an uneasy sleep, occasionally murmuring or tensing against him. Mason hated to wake her, but they needed to get inside. "Miss Fairchild," he said softly, "we're here." She startled awake, momentarily confused before remembering where she was and why. The pain in her eyes made Mason's chest tighten. He helped her down from the horse, supporting most of her weight as they made their way to the cabin. Inside, a single room served as kitchen, living area, and bedroom combined. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and simple furnishings, a table with 2 chairs, a trunk, a rocking chair, and a bed filled the space. It was clean and orderly, if sparse. "You take the bed," Mason said, leading her to it. "I'll sleep by the fire." Julia looked too exhausted to argue. She sank onto the edge of the bed, still wrapped in his coat. "I'm afraid I've ruined your coat with soot and ash." "It's seen worse," he assured her, busying himself with lighting the fire. "Are you hungry? I can make some coffee and warm up some beans." She shook her head, "Just tired," and her voice broke. "I keep seeing it, the fire, hearing the shots." Mason paused, unsure how to comfort her. He wasn't good with words, never had been, but he understood loss and the way it hollowed you out. "Sometimes," he said carefully, "the only thing that helps is to let yourself feel it, all of it. Then get up the next day and take one step, just one." She looked at him with surprise, as if she hadn't expected such insight from a cowboy. "Is that what you did?" she asked softly. Mason's jaw tightened. He rarely spoke about his past. "Something like that." He moved to the trunk at the foot of the bed and pulled out a clean shirt. "You can wear this to sleep in. It'll be big, but it's clean. I'll step outside while you change." Julia accepted the shirt with murmured thanks. When Mason returned a few minutes later, she had changed and was sitting on the edge of the bed, her damaged dress folded beside her. His shirt hung like a dress on her slender frame, the sleeves rolled up several times. Mason stoked the fire, then spread his bedroll on the floor nearby. The cabin was warming up, but he placed an extra blanket at the foot of the bed. "If you need anything in the night, just ask." "I'm a light sleeper." Julia nodded, easing herself under the covers with a wince. "Mr. Alden, thank you for everything." "Mason," he corrected gently. "And you're welcome, Miss Fairchild." "Julia," she replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips for the first time. "If I'm to stay in your home, we should at least be on a first-name basis." Mason nodded, feeling strangely pleased. "Get some rest, Julia." He watched as she closed her eyes, her breathing eventually slowing into the rhythm of sleep. Only then did he allow himself to lie down, though he knew rest would be elusive. Too many questions plagued his mind. What would they do about Maddox? Where would Julia go once she healed? And why did he feel so fiercely protective of a woman he'd just met? The answers would have to wait. For now, his job was simple. Keep her safe, help her heal. One step at a time. The sound of muffled crying woke Mason before sunrise. He sat up, momentarily confused before remembering his house guest. Julia was still in his bed, curled into herself, shoulders shaking with silent sobs. He approached cautiously, not wanting to startle her. "Julia," she stiffened, trying to suppress her tears. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." Mason sat on the edge of the bed. "Don't apologize, you've been through hell." In the dim light, he could see the tracks of tears on her face. Without thinking, he reached out and gently wiped one away with his thumb. The tenderness of the gesture surprised them both, and he quickly withdrew his hand. "I keep seeing them," she whispered. "My family. We were having supper when we heard the horses. My father knew something was wrong. He told me to check the barn to hide if there was trouble." Her voice cracked. "I should have stayed with them. Maybe I could have." "No," Mason said firmly. "You'd be dead too. Your father saved your life by sending you out there." She looked at him, green eyes swimming with tears. "But what life is that now? Everything I had is gone." Mason had no easy answers. "I wish I could tell you the pain goes away. It doesn't, but you learn to carry it, and you're not alone." "I am alone," she countered. "Everyone I love is gone." "You have people willing to help," he insisted. "Doc Miller, me. You don't even know me." "I know enough." Mason stood, uncomfortable with the emotion building between them. "Try to get more rest. I'll make breakfast soon." As he moved away, Julia caught his hand. Her touch was light, but it stopped him as effectively as a lasso. "Thank you, Mason, for the coat, for bringing me here, for not letting go." The simple gratitude in her voice touched something deep inside him. He squeezed her hand gently before releasing it. "Get some sleep, Julia." By mid-morning, Julia had fallen into a deeper sleep, her body finally surrendering to exhaustion. Mason used the opportunity to tend to his horse, check his supplies, and plan what to do next. They would need more food if Julia was staying for any length of time, and he'd have to let the foreman at Wilcox Ranch know he wouldn't be available for a few days. He was splitting wood when he heard hoofbeats approaching. Setting down his axe, Mason retrieved his rifle from beside the door and positioned himself where he could see the trail. Relief washed over him when he recognized Sheriff Tom Brady. The lawman was in his 50s with a gray mustache and a reputation for fairness, though his jurisdiction was limited by manpower and the vast territory he was expected to cover. "Morning, Mason," Brady called as he dismounted. "Sheriff," Mason acknowledged. "What brings you out this way?" "Doc Miller told me about the Fairchild girl," Brady said, his expression grim. "Rode out to what's left of their place this morning. Nasty business." Mason leaned his rifle against the cabin. "She says it was Maddox's men." Brady sighed heavily. "That's what I figured." "Found 3 bodies in the ruins. Could barely identify them." He removed his hat, running a hand through his thinning hair. "How's the girl doing, physically? She'll heal, the rest." Mason shook his head. Can I speak with her? Need to get her statement. Mason hesitated. She's finally sleeping. Been through enough already. Brady studied him with interest. Never figured you for the protective type, Alden. Mason chose not to respond to that. Coffee. Just made a fresh pot. They moved to the small table on the cabin's porch where Mason poured 2 cups of strong black coffee. What can be done about Maddox? Mason asked. Brady blew on his coffee before taking a sip. Officially, not much without proof. Those men of his are careful, never leave witnesses. He gave Mason a significant look. Except this time, the implication was clear. You think they'll come after her? I'd bet my badge on it. Once Maddox learns there's a survivor who can identify his men, he'll want to tie up that loose end. Brady set down his cup. She needs to leave the territory, Mason, soon as she's able to travel. Mason's jaw tightened. The thought of sending Julia away stirred an unexpected feeling of protest. And let Maddox get away with murder. I don't like it any more than you do, Brady said. But I've got no deputies, and Maddox has at least 15 gun hands. Those aren't odds I'd take, and I sure wouldn't risk that girl's life on them. They fell silent as the door opened behind them. Julia stood in the doorway, leaning heavily on the frame. She wore Mason's shirt and the trousers he'd left out for her, rolled up several times at the ankles. Her hair was pulled back in a simple braid, and though her face was pale, her eyes were clear and determined. I'm not running away, she said firmly. Sheriff, I presume. Brady stood, hat in hand. Miss Fairchild, Tom Brady, I'm mighty sorry about your family. She acknowledged this with a slight nod. Did you find them? Yes, madam. We'll give them a proper burial in the Pinewood Cemetery if that's acceptable to you. Thank you. Her voice was steady, but Mason could see the effort it took to maintain her composure. I want to be there. Of course. Brady cleared his throat. Miss Fairchild, I understand you recognize the men who attacked your family. I did. They work for Victor Maddox. One had a scar from his eye to his jaw. Another was tall with a black hat and silver band. The third was younger with red hair. She stepped forward, wincing as she put weight on her injured ankle. My father refused to sell our land to Maddox. He'd been threatening us for months. Mason moved to her side, offering his arm for support. After a moment's hesitation, she took it, allowing him to guide her to a chair. I'll note your statement, Brady said, but I have to be honest with you. Without more evidence, it's unlikely we can bring charges against Maddox. Julia's fingers tightened on Mason's arm. So my family dies and nothing happens. Is that justice, Sheriff? No, madam, it's not. But it's the reality of our situation. Brady's expression was sympathetic but firm. Mason and I were just discussing the possibility of you leaving the territory for a while, at least until things cool down. I'm not leaving, Julia said, her voice sharp. That land has been in my family for 15 years. My father is buried there, along with my mother and brother. I won't be driven away. Mason admired her spirit even as he worried about her safety. Julia, Maddox won't stop. If he finds out you survived, then I'll face him, she interrupted. I've lost everything, Mason. Everything except my land and my dignity. I won't lose those too. Sheriff Brady exchanged a look with Mason. Miss Fairchild, I understand your feelings, but please consider your safety. Mason's cabin is remote, but it won't stay secret forever that you're here. Julia's shoulders slumped slightly, the first sign that her determined facade might be cracking. What would you have me do? Where would I go? My sister runs a boarding house in Denver, Brady offered. It would only be temporary until we can figure out a more permanent solution. Mason felt her trembling slightly where her arm pressed against his. Despite her brave words, she was exhausted and overwhelmed. You don't have to decide anything right now, he told her. You need to heal first. Julia looked up at him, searching his face. Whatever she saw there seemed to reassure her. All right, I'll think about it. Brady seemed satisfied with this compromise. That's all I ask. Now, if you're up to it, I need to ask a few more questions about what you saw that night. For the next half hour, Julia recounted the events leading up to the attack and what she had witnessed. Mason marveled at her composure, though he could see the toll it took on her to relive those moments. When Brady finally stood to leave, he placed his hat on his head and fixed Mason with a serious look. I'll keep an eye out for strangers in town, but you should be vigilant. Maddox has eyes everywhere. I always am, Mason assured him. After the sheriff rode away, Mason turned to find Julia still sitting at the table staring at her hands. You need to rest, he said gently. Doc's orders. I've been sleeping all morning, she protested weakly. Then at least stay off that ankle. I need to change the bandages anyway. He helped her inside and settled her in the rocking chair near the fire. As he carefully unwrapped the bandage around her ankle, he was aware of her watching him. You're good at that, she commented. Mason shrugged. Spent enough time patching up myself and injured horses. How long have you been on your own? She asked. The question caught him off guard. Few people asked about his past, and he rarely volunteered information. But something about Julia made him want to answer. Since I was 17, he said, applying the salve Doc Miller had provided. Parents died of fever. Had an uncle in Texas for a while, but we didn't see eye to eye. Been drifting ever since until I settled here about 3 years ago. Why here? Mason carefully wrapped a fresh bandage around her ankle. Like the mountains, the solitude. Found work at the Wilcox Ranch breaking horses, saved enough to buy this piece of land. Don't you get lonely? He finished with her ankle and sat back on his heels, considering her question. Never really thought about it that way. I've got my horses, my work, don't need much else. Julia studied him with those perceptive green eyes. Everyone needs something else, Mason, even if they don't know it yet. Her words stirred something uncomfortable in his chest. He stood abruptly. I'll make us some lunch. You must be hungry by now. As he busied himself preparing a simple meal of beans, bacon, and cornbread, Mason found himself uncharacteristically flustered. It had been years since a woman had been in his cabin, longer still since one had made him question his solitary existence. He told himself it was just the unusual circumstances, the tragedy, her vulnerability, his natural protective instincts. But deep down, Mason knew there was something more. Something about Julia Fairchild that had gotten under his skin from the moment he'd wrapped his coat around her shoulders and promised to keep her safe. The days fell into a rhythm as Julia recovered. Mason would rise early, tend to his few animals, and prepare breakfast before she woke. They would eat together, Mason often leaving soon after to work around the property while Julia rested or sat on the porch, gaining strength. In the evenings, they would share a simple dinner, then sit by the fire. Sometimes they talked, other times they sat in comfortable silence. Mason found himself looking forward to these quiet moments, to the sound of her voice as she shared memories of her family or asked questions about his life. A week after her arrival, Julia was able to put more weight on her ankle. She insisted on helping around the cabin, despite Mason's protests. He found her sweeping the floor one afternoon, using a chair for support. You shouldn't be up, he chided, taking the broom from her hands. I'm not an invalid, she replied stubbornly. Besides, I can't keep letting you do everything. I don't mind, he said honestly. Well, I do. Julia straightened, wincing slightly. I've never been idle in my life, Mason. My mother taught me to be useful. On a homestead, everyone works. Mason recognized the pride in her voice, the need to maintain some control over her circumstances. All right, he conceded, but nothing strenuous. She rewarded him with a smile that made his heart beat faster. Deal. After that, Julia took over small tasks, mending his shirts, preparing vegetables for dinner, organizing his surprisingly disordered kitchen shelves. Mason found himself enjoying the changes she brought to his home. The cabin seemed warmer somehow, more alive. Doc Miller visited after 10 days, pronouncing her healing well but still in need of rest. "That ankle needs another week at least," he insisted. "And you're still too thin. Mason, you need to feed this girl more." "He tries," Julia laughed. "But his cooking is limited to beans and bacon." Mason feigned offense. "My cornbread is legendary, for its weight perhaps," she teased. "I think you could build a cabin with it." Doc Miller watched their exchange with interest. "Well, you seem to be getting along just fine. Sheriff Brady asked me to tell you he's been keeping an eye on Maddox's men. So far, they don't seem to know about your survival, Miss Fairchild." Julia's expression sobered. "And my family, were they?" "Laid to rest 3 days ago," Doc confirmed gently. "Several neighbors attended. The Hansons, the Williamsons, even old Mrs. Peterson came from town." Tears welled in Julia's eyes. "I should have been there." "You will be," Mason said, surprising himself with the promise. "When you're stronger, I'll take you to visit them." Julia looked at him gratefully. "Thank you." After Doc Miller left, a melancholy settled over Julia. Mason gave her space, busying himself with chores outside. When he returned for dinner, he found her sitting on the porch, staring at the setting sun. "I need to decide what to do," she said without looking at him. "About my land." "About Maddox." Mason sat beside her. "What are you thinking? I could sell it. Use the money to start over somewhere else." She sighed heavily. "That's what Sheriff Brady would advise. But it feels like I'd be letting them win, letting my family die for nothing." She turned to face him. "What would you do, Mason?" He considered her question carefully. "I can't tell you what's right, but I know what it means to have a place that's yours, something that can't be taken away. That's what my father always said, that the land was our legacy." She looked out at the mountains, painted gold and purple in the fading light. "I don't want to leave, not the land and not—" She stopped, looking down at her hands. "Not what?" Mason prompted softly. Julia met his gaze, something vulnerable in her eyes. "Not you. You've been so kind, so. I feel safe here with you." The admission hung between them, honest and fragile. Mason wanted to tell her that the thought of her leaving made his chest ache, that these 2 weeks with her had changed something fundamental inside him. But the words wouldn't come. Instead, he reached out and took her hand in his calloused fingers enveloping her smaller ones. "You can stay as long as you need. I meant what I said that first night. I won't let go until you're safe." Julia's fingers tightened around his. "What if I never feel safe enough to let go?" The question stirred something deep in Mason's heart, a possibility he hadn't allowed himself to consider. Before he could respond, the sound of approaching riders broke the moment. Mason was on his feet instantly, hand moving to the pistol at his hip. "Get inside," he told Julia, his voice low and urgent. She obeyed without question, disappearing into the cabin as Mason stepped off the porch, positioning himself to face the approaching visitors. Relief washed over him when he recognized the riders Will Wilcox and his son James from the ranch where Mason worked. "Evening, Mason," Will called as they approached. "Hope we're not intruding." "Not at all," Mason replied, relaxing his stance. "What brings you out this way?" Will dismounted, a stocky man in his 50s with weathered features and honest eyes. "Wondering when you might be returning to work. Got 3 new Mustangs need breaking and no one handles them like you do." James, a lanky young man of 20, remained on his horse, paws being polite. "What he means is, those horses are raising hell in the corral and costing us money every day they're not broken." Mason smiled slightly. "I've been meaning to send word. had some unexpected circumstances. The cabin door opened behind him and Julia stepped out. She had changed into the clean dress Doc Miller had brought from town, her hair neatly braided. Even with her slight limp, she carried herself with dignity. Will and James stared in surprise. "This is Miss Julia Fairchild," Mason said, moving to her side. "Julia, this is Will Wilcox and his son James. I work at their ranch." Understanding dawned in Will's eyes. "The Fairchild girl. We heard what happened. Terrible business." "Thank you, Mr. Wilcox," Julia said politely. An awkward silence fell, broken when Will cleared his throat. "Well, we don't want to intrude on your recovery. Mason, when you think you might be available," Mason glanced at Julia. "Another week, perhaps, if that's workable," Will nodded. "We'll manage. Those horses aren't going anywhere." He tipped his hat to Julia. "Miss Fairchild, if there's anything you need, you let us know. The Wilcox Ranch stands with our neighbors against men like Maddox." "Thank you," Julia said, genuine gratitude in her voice. "That means a great deal." After the Wilcoxes departed, Mason and Julia returned to the porch. The easy intimacy of their earlier moment had been broken, replaced by a new awareness of their situation. "People will talk," Julia said quietly. "A single woman staying with a bachelor." "Let them," Mason replied, more forcefully than he intended. "It's your reputation, too," she pointed out. "I've never much cared what people think." He leaned against the porch railing, studying her. "Does it bother you?" Julia considered the question. "A week ago I would have said yes, but now—" She shook her head. "After watching everything I loved burn, gossip seems rather insignificant." Mason nodded, understanding completely. "Things have a way of clarifying when you face the worst." "Yes," she agreed softly. "They do." That night, Mason lay awake longer than usual, listening to Julia's steady breathing from the bed. The conversation with the Wilcoxes had forced him to acknowledge that their arrangement couldn't continue indefinitely. Eventually, Julia would have to decide whether to stay and fight for her land or leave for somewhere safer. Either way, things would change. The thought left a hollow feeling in his stomach. In just 2 weeks, he had grown accustomed to her presence in his home, to the sound of her voice and the warmth of her smile. The idea of returning to his solitary existence no longer appealed to him the way it once had. Sometime after midnight, he heard Julia stirring, then the soft pad of her feet as she moved to the window. Moonlight streamed in, illuminating her silhouette. She stood there for a long moment, looking out at the night. "Can't sleep?" Mason asked quietly, sitting up. She turned, not startled by his voice. "Bad dreams." He rose and moved to stand beside her at the window. Outside, the mountains were silvered by moonlight, the forest a dark sea around the small clearing of his property. "What were they about?" he asked. "The fire at first. Then—" She hesitated. "I dreamed I was alone again, truly alone." The vulnerability in her voice tugged at Mason's heart. Without thinking, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear, his fingers lingering against the softness of her cheek. "You're not alone, Julia." She leaned into his touch, her eyes meeting his in the darkness. "I've never met anyone like you, Mason Alden." "Stubborn and taciturn," he suggested, trying to lighten the moment. "Honorable," she corrected. "Kind, despite trying to hide it. Strong, not just in body, but in spirit." Her words made something shift inside him, a wall beginning to crumble. Mason had spent years keeping people at a distance, convinced that attachment only led to pain. But standing there with Julia, her face tilted up to his in the moonlight, he found himself wanting to take the risk. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he lowered his head until his lips met hers. The kiss was gentle, almost hesitant, a question rather than a demand. When Julia's arms slipped around his neck, her body leaning into his, Mason deepened the kiss, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other encircled her waist. Time seemed to stop as they stood there in the moonlight, learning the contours of each other's lips. When they finally broke apart, both were breathing unevenly. "I shouldn't have done that," Mason said, though he made no move to step away. "Why not?" Julia asked, her hands still resting on his shoulders. "You're vulnerable. You've lost everything, and I'm taking advantage." She shook her head, a small smile playing at her lips. "Mason Alden, do you really think me so weak-minded that I don't know my own heart?" "No," but she silenced him with another brief kiss. "I may have lost my family and my home, but I still know what I want, who I want." The simple declaration undid him completely. Mason pulled her closer, burying his face in her hair. "I never expected you," he murmured. "Never thought I needed anyone. And now," he drew back enough to look into her eyes, "now I can't imagine letting you go." Julia's smile was like sunrise breaking over the mountains. "Then don't." The decision to travel to Pinewood Creek for the town's Sunday services was not made lightly. After 2.5 weeks at Mason's cabin, Julia was healing well, but the threat from Maddox's men remained. However, she was determined to visit her family's graves, and Mason knew it was important for her healing. They set out early, Julia riding Mason's gentlest mare while he rode alongside her on a stallion borrowed from the Wilcox ranch. She wore a simple blue dress that Mrs. Wilcox had sent over, her auburn hair pinned up beneath a bonnet. Despite her still healing ankle, she sat tall in the saddle. "Are you sure about this?" Mason asked as they neared town. "People will have questions." "Let them ask," Julia replied with quiet resolve. "I have nothing to hide." Mason admired her courage. Since the night they had shared their first kiss, something had changed between them, a deepening of trust, an acknowledgement of feelings that had been building since the moment he found her limping from the fire. They hadn't discussed the future in concrete terms, but Mason knew with certainty that he wanted Julia in his life permanently. The small church at the edge of town was already filling with families when they arrived. Mason helped Julia dismount, conscious of the curious glances directed their way. He offered his arm for support, which she took without hesitation. "Miss Fairchild," a woman's voice called. Martha Peterson, the town's seamstress, approached with a sympathetic expression. "We've all been so worried about you, dear. Such a terrible tragedy." Several other townspeople gathered around, offering condolences and asking after her health. Julia answered their questions with grace, thanking them for attending her family's funeral. Mason stood protectively at her side, watchful for any sign that the attention was becoming too much. Sheriff Brady appeared, nodding in approval when he saw them. "Good to see you up and about, Miss Fairchild." "Mason." As they made their way into the church, Mason noticed 3 men at the back, strangers he didn't recognize. One wore a black hat with a silver band, the description Julia had given of one of her attackers. Mason tensed, his hand moving instinctively to the pistol hidden beneath his coat. "Don't," Julia whispered, her hand tightening on his arm. "Not here. Those men, I know," she cut him off. "The one with the hat. He was there that night." Mason's jaw clenched. "We should leave." "No," Julia said firmly. "I won't be driven away. Not from my family's graves, not from town, and certainly not from church." Her courage both impressed and concerned him. "At least let me tell Brady." She nodded, and Mason caught the sheriff's eye, tilting his head subtly toward the men at the back. Brady's expression remained neutral, but he gave a nearly imperceptible nod of understanding. Throughout the service, Mason remained hyper-aware of the men's presence. They made no move toward Julia, but their eyes followed her. When the congregation rose for the final hymn, Mason noticed one of the men slip outside. As people began to file out, Brady approached them. "Stay inside for a bit," he murmured. "I'll handle this." Julia and Mason remained in their pew as the church emptied. Through the window, Mason could see Brady speaking with the men outside, his posture casual but his hand resting on his gun belt. "I need to visit the graves," Julia said softly. "It's not safe," Mason replied. "Those men are Maddox's. They know you survived now." "Then they already knew before today," she reasoned. "Mason, I have to do this for my family, for myself." He studied her determined expression and knew she wouldn't be dissuaded. "All right, but we wait until Brady gives the all clear." A few minutes later, the sheriff returned. "They've ridden out," he reported, claimed they were just passing through, wanted to attend services. His expression was grim. "But they'll be back, or others will. Word will get to Maddox that you're alive if it hasn't already." "I need to visit the cemetery," Julia told him. Brady nodded. "I'll accompany you. Mason, too." The small cemetery lay behind the church, newer graves marked with wooden crosses until permanent stones could be arranged. 3 fresh mounds of earth marked where Julia's family had been laid to rest. Mason and Brady kept a respectful distance as Julia knelt beside the graves, her head bowed in prayer. Mason's chest tightened as he watched her place wildflowers on each mound. Her strength in the face of such loss amazed him. When she finally stood and returned to his side, her eyes were dry but filled with a quiet determination. "I know what I need to do now," she said. "And what's that?" Mason asked. "Fight back." She looked between Mason and the sheriff. "I won't sell my land to Maddox. I won't run away." "But I can't do it alone." Brady sighed heavily. "Miss Fairchild, I admire your spirit, but Maddox has too many men, too much influence." "But he doesn't have the law on his side," Julia countered. "My family was murdered. There must be a way to prove it." "The law moves slowly out here," Brady explained. "Even with your testimony, it could take months to build a case strong enough to bring charges against Maddox." "Then I'll wait months," she said firmly. "Years, if necessary." Mason took her hand, squeezing it gently. "You won't be waiting alone." Julia's eyes met his, gratitude and something deeper shining in their green depths. "I know." As they prepared to leave the cemetery, a rider approached at a gallop Will Wilcox's son James. He reined in his horse sharply when he saw them. "Mason, Sheriff," he called, dismounting quickly. "Maddox's men are heading toward your cabin, Mason, 6 of them, armed. Pa sent me to warn you." Mason's blood ran cold. "How long ago?" 20 minutes, maybe less." James looked at Julia apologetically. They were talking about finding the Fairchild girl. Brady drew his pistol, checking the chambers. "They're making their move. Probably figured you'd be in town for Sunday service, planned to catch you returning home. Or to wait for us there," Mason added grimly. "What do we do?" Julia asked, her voice steady despite the fear Mason could see in her eyes. Brady considered for a moment. "James, ride back to your father. Tell him we need men armed and ready. Mason, take Miss Fairchild to my office. It's the safest place in town right now." "No," Mason said firmly. "That's the first place they'll look once they realize we're not at the cabin." "Then where?" Brady demanded. Mason looked at Julia, then back at the sheriff. "The Fairchild homestead. They won't expect us to go there." Julia's eyes widened. "But it's destroyed. There's nothing left." "Exactly," Mason said. "They won't think to look for us in the ashes of your home, and it gives us the advantage of knowing the terrain." Brady frowned. "It's risky." "Everything is risky now," Mason replied. "But I know the back trails. We can get there without being seen from the main road." After a moment's consideration, Brady nodded. "All right. James, tell your father to gather men and meet us at the Fairchild place. I'll round up whoever I can in town." Julia looked between the men. "This is happening because of me. I can't ask you all to risk your lives." "You're not asking," Mason told her quietly. "We're offering." Something passed between them in that moment, an understanding, a promise. Whatever came next, they would face it together. They mounted quickly, Mason helping Julia onto her horse before swinging up onto his own. With a nod to Brady and James, they set off, taking the back trail that would lead them to what remained of the Fairchild homestead. As they rode, Mason kept a vigilant watch, one hand resting on his rifle. Beside him, Julia rode with determination, her posture straight despite the pain he knew she must be feeling in her ankle. "Are you all right?" he asked when they paused to water the horses at a small stream. "Yes," she said, though her face was pale. "Just thinking about going back there." Seeing it again. Mason moved his horse alongside hers, reaching out to take her hand. "We don't have to. We could head for the Wilcox Ranch instead." Julia shook her head. "No, you were right, they won't expect us at the homestead. And," she took a deep breath, "I need to face it. To see what's left." He squeezed her hand. "You're the bravest person I've ever known, Julia Fairchild." A small smile touched her lips. "Not brave, just stubborn. My father always said I got that from my mother." "I wish I could have met them," Mason said sincerely. "They would have liked you," Julia replied, her voice soft with memory. "My father appreciated honest, hard-working men, and my mother." Her smile widened slightly. "Well, she always told me to find a man who would wrap me in his coat when I was cold." The simple statement touched Mason deeply. He remembered that first night, how naturally he had placed his coat around her shoulders, how right it had felt to protect her. "We should keep moving," he said, reluctantly releasing her hand. "It's still a few miles to your homestead." They rode in companionable silence, taking the less traveled paths through the foothills. By mid-afternoon, they approached the burned-out remains of the Fairchild farm. Even from a distance, the sight was sobering, the blackened skeleton of the house, the collapsed barn, the eerie stillness where a family had once lived and worked. Mason felt Julia stiffen beside him. He glanced at her, concerned by the pallor of her face. "We can stop here," he offered. "Scout the area first." "No," she said, her voice barely audible. "I need to see it." They approached cautiously, alert for any sign of Maddox's men. The homestead appeared deserted, the destruction complete. Mason helped Julia dismount, keeping a supportive arm around her waist as they walked toward what remained of the house. Julia moved through the ruins like a ghost, touching a charred beam here, a broken piece of furniture there. Mason stayed close, ready to catch her if her strength failed, but she remained upright, her grief evident but controlled. "This was the kitchen," she said, indicating a corner where an iron stove still stood among the ashes. "My mother taught me to bake bread there." "And over there was the sitting room where my father would read to us in the evenings." Mason listened, understanding her need to speak the memories aloud, to give voice to what had been lost. When they reached what had been the front porch, Julia stopped, her eyes fixed on something in the rubble. She bent down, retrieving a small, blackened object, a metal music box, its lid warped from the heat but still intact. With trembling fingers, she tried to open it. The hinges creaked, and a faint, tinny melody began to play. "My father gave this to my mother on their wedding day," Julia whispered. "I thought everything was gone." Mason placed his hand on her shoulder, a silent offering of support. For a long moment, they stood together among the ruins, the music box's faltering melody the only sound besides the wind. The peace was shattered by the distant sound of horses approaching. "Get down," Mason ordered, pulling Julia behind what remained of a stone wall. From their position, they could see 6 riders approaching along the main road, Maddox's men, heavily armed. The man with the silver-banded hat appeared to be leading them. "They must have realized we weren't at my cabin and guessed where we'd go," Mason muttered, drawing his rifle. "Stay here. I'll try to hold them off until Brady and the others arrive. Julia grabbed his arm. You can't take on 6 men alone. I don't plan to engage unless necessary, he assured her. Just keep them at bay. Before he could move, however, more hoofbeats sounded from the opposite direction. Relief washed over Mason as he recognized Sheriff Brady, Will Wilcox, and at least 10 other men from town and neighboring ranches. Looks like our reinforcements arrived just in time, Mason said, a grim smile on his face. They watched as Brady and his posse intercepted Maddox's men in the clearing before the ruined homestead. The two groups faced each other, tension thick in the air. That's far enough, Scar, Brady called, addressing the man with the distinctive facial mark. You're trespassing on Fairchild property. No law against visiting the site of a tragedy, Sheriff, Scar replied with a mocking smile. Just paying our respects. With 6 armed men. Brady's voice was cold. I think not. You're here for Miss Fairchild, and that makes your intentions clear. The girl's causing trouble, Scar said, his hand hovering near his pistol. Mr. Maddox just wants to talk to her, straighten things out, like you talk to her family. Will Wilcox interjected angrily. Tension crackled between the two groups. Mason shifted, positioning himself to better protect Julia if shooting started. Miss Fairchild has made a statement identifying you and your companions as the men who murdered her family, Brady announced loudly. I'm placing you under arrest. All of you, throw down your weapons, Scar laughed. You and what army, Sheriff? This one, came a new voice. Everyone turned to see a tall, distinguished man riding up with several uniformed soldiers. Mason recognized Marshal Robert Davis, the federal lawman whose jurisdiction covered the entire territory. Marshal Davis, Brady acknowledged with evident relief. Your timing is impeccable. Got your telegram about the Fairchild murders, Davis replied, his hard gaze fixed on Maddox's men. Thought I'd come see for myself what kind of vermin are operating in my territory. Scar and his companions exchanged uneasy glances, suddenly outnumbered and facing federal authority. These men are under arrest for the murders of John, Mary, and Thomas Fairchild, Marshal Davis declared. Sheriff Brady, if you and your men would assist in taking them into custody. What happened next unfolded in a blur of motion. Scar drew his pistol, firing at the marshal. The shot went wide, and in an instant, the clearing erupted in gunfire. Mason pushed Julia flat against the ground, covering her body with his own as bullets flew overhead. When he dared to look up, 2 of Maddox's men were down, and the others, including Scar, were fleeing toward the trees. Stay here, Mason ordered, rushing toward the fray with his rifle ready. Brady, Davis, and several others were in pursuit of the fleeing men. Mason joined Will Wilcox and James in securing those who had been wounded or surrendered. The gunfight continued in the distance, shots echoing through the trees. Mason helped bind the wrists of one of Maddox's wounded men, then looked back toward where he had left Julia, only to find she was no longer there. Panic gripped him until he spotted her emerging from behind the ruined house, supporting herself on a piece of wood as a makeshift cane. In her other hand, she held a pistol, one she must have retrieved from somewhere in the ruins. Julia, he called, rushing to her side. What are you doing? Making sure none of them circled back, she replied, her face set with determination. A movement behind her caught Mason's eye. Scar, emerging from the trees with his gun raised. Without hesitation, Mason threw himself forward, knocking Julia aside as the shot rang out. Pain exploded in his shoulder and he fell to one knee. Mason, Julia screamed. Through a haze of pain, Mason saw her raise the pistol and fire. Her shot caught Scar in the chest, sending him staggering backward before collapsing to the ground. The next moments were chaotic. Julia was beside him, pressing something against his bleeding shoulder. Brady and the others returned, securing the remaining outlaws. Someone will Wilcox, he thought, was saying they needed to get him to a doctor. "I'm fine," Mason insisted, though the world was spinning alarmingly. "Just a flesh wound." "You're not fine," Julia said fiercely, tears streaming down her face. "You could have been killed." "Couldn't let him hurt you," Mason mumbled, reaching up to touch her cheek, leaving a smear of blood. "Promised I'd keep you safe." The last thing he saw before darkness claimed him was Julia's face above his, her green eyes wide with fear, and something else, something that looked remarkably like love. Mason drifted in and out of consciousness as they transported him to town. He was vaguely aware of being in a wagon, of Julia's hand holding his, of her voice urging him to stay with her. He awoke fully in Doc Miller's surgery, the familiar smell of antiseptic and herbs filling his nostrils. His shoulder was bandaged, the pain dulled to a persistent throb. When he tried to move, a gentle hand pressed him back. "Don't you dare," Julia said, her voice simultaneously stern and tender. "Doc says you need to lie still." Mason turned his head to find her seated beside the bed, her face pale with exhaustion but her eyes alert. "How long have I been out?" "Nearly a day," she replied, relief evident in her voice. "The bullet went clean through, but you lost a lot of blood." Memory returned in fragments: the gunfight, Scar's ambush, Julia with the pistol. "You shot him," he said, the realization still somewhat surprising. A shadow crossed her face. "Yes, he's dead." Mason reached for her hand with his uninjured arm. "You saved my life." "You saved mine first," she countered, her fingers intertwining with his. "Seems to be a habit of yours." The door opened, and Doc Miller entered, followed by Sheriff Brady and Marshal Davis. "Good to see you awake, Alden," the marshal said. "Thought we might have lost you for a while there." Doc Miller checked Mason's bandages and pulse. "He's tougher than he looks. Should make a full recovery with proper rest." "What happened with Maddox's men?" Mason asked, wincing as he tried to sit up straighter. Brady's expression was grimly satisfied. "We got them all. 3 dead, including that scar-faced bastard. The rest are locked up, singing like canaries to save their own necks. Gave us enough to arrest Maddox himself this morning." Julia's hand tightened around Mason's. "Really? He's in custody?" Marshal Davis nodded. "At the territorial prison in Helena. He'll stand trial for ordering the murders of the Fairchild family, among other charges. Between Miss Fairchild's testimony and what his men have told us, he'll hang for sure." The news was almost too good to believe. Mason looked at Julia, seeing hope dawn in her eyes for perhaps the first time since he'd found her limping from the fire. "It's over," she whispered, as if afraid to believe it. "Not quite," Brady said, his tone softening. "There's still the matter of your homestead, Miss Fairchild. The land is still yours, but everything's gone," she finished for him. "I know." "Actually," the marshal interjected, "there's something you should know. Maddox wasn't just after your land for ranching. There's a reason he was so determined to get it." Julia frowned. "What do you mean?" "The survey team that came through last month found silver on the north ridge of your property," Davis explained. "Not a massive deposit, but enough to be valuable. Maddox knew it had someone on that team in his pocket." The revelation left them all momentarily speechless. Mason watched Julia's expression shift from shock to disbelief to cautious hope. "So my land," she began, "is worth considerably more than anyone realized," the marshal confirmed. "Enough to rebuild several times over if that's what you want." Doc Miller cleared his throat. "That's enough excitement for now. My patient needs rest, and Miss Fairchild could use some too, I'd wager." The men nodded, offering final congratulations before leaving. When they were alone again, Mason turned to Julia, who seemed overwhelmed by this new development. "Silver," she said incredulously. "My father always said that land would provide for us. I never imagined how right he was." Mason squeezed her hand. "What will you do now?" It was the question that had haunted him since he regained consciousness. Julia was no longer penniless or in danger. She could rebuild her home, start a new life, one that might not include a simple cowboy with nothing to offer but his heart. Julia studied his face, seeming to read his thoughts. A slow smile spread across her features, the first genuine smile he'd seen from her since the night of the fire. "First," she said, "I'm going to make sure you heal properly after that." She leaned closer, her free hand gently touching his face. "I was thinking we might rebuild together, if you're interested." Relief and joy flooded through Mason. "I'm very interested," he replied, his voice rough with emotion. "Good," Julia whispered, leaning down to press a gentle kiss to his lips. "Because I've grown rather attached to your coat and I'm not ready to give it back just yet." 3 months later, the new Fairchild Alden ranch house stood completed on the site of the old Fairchild homestead. It was larger than the original, built with sturdy pine logs and featuring a wide porch that wrapped around 3 sides. A barn and corral housed Mason's growing herd of horses, while the silver mine on the North Ridge operated under the supervision of a foreman Julia had hired. The day was bright and clear as Julia stood on the porch, watching Mason work with a young mare in the corral. His shoulder had healed well, though it still troubled him in cold weather. He moved with the confident grace that had first captured her attention, speaking softly to the horse as he gained its trust. So much had changed since that terrible night when her world had burned around her. She had lost everything, only to find something she hadn't known she was missing. The wedding had been small, held in the Pinewood Creek Church just 6 weeks after the shootout. Julia had worn a simple white dress, Mason a new suit that made him look uncomfortable but undeniably handsome. Sheriff Brady had given her away, and half the town had attended the celebration afterward. Now, as spring turned the meadows green around their new home, Julia felt a sense of peace she had thought lost forever. She placed a hand on her still flat stomach, smiling at the secret she would share with Mason that evening. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice him approaching until he was climbing the porch steps, his familiar leather duster coat hanging from his shoulders. "That mare's going to make a fine riding horse," he said, his smile warming her heart as it always did. "Spirited but gentle. Reminds me of someone I know." Julia laughed, stepping into his embrace. "I'll take that as a compliment, Mr. Alden." "As it was intended, Mrs. Alden," he replied, pressing a kiss to her forehead. The sound of approaching horses drew their attention. Will and James Wilcox were riding up the trail, likely coming to discuss the horses they'd purchased from Mason's growing business. "We should invite them to stay for dinner," Julia suggested. Mason nodded. "I'll tell Maria to set extra places." Their housekeeper, a widow from town, had become almost like family in recent months. As Mason stepped inside to speak with Maria, Julia remained on the porch, watching the Wilcoxes approach. The sun was beginning to set, painting the mountains gold and purple, much like that evening when she and Mason had first acknowledged their feelings for each other. She thought about how far they had come from a night of terror, and lost to this new life they were building together. The pain of losing her family would never completely fade, but she had found healing in Mason's steadfast love and in the community that had rallied around them. When Mason returned to her side, she leaned against him, drawing strength from his solid presence as she always did. "Happy?" he asked softly, his arm around her waist. Julia nodded, looking up at the man who had wrapped her in his coat on the worst night of her life and had never truly let go since. "More than I ever thought possible," she replied truthfully. As the Wilcoxes reached the yard and Mason moved to greet them, Julia remained on the porch for a moment longer, her hand resting on her stomach where their child grew. From tragedy had come new beginnings, from loss had come love. The ranch house stood where ashes had been, a symbol of resilience and hope. And as Julia watched her husband, the quiet, honorable cowboy who had become the center of her world, she knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The story that had begun with fire and pain had transformed into something beautiful, a love forged in adversity, tempered by courage, and destined to endure. 5 years later, the Fairchild Alden Ranch had become one of the most prosperous in the territory. The silver mine continued to produce, though at a more modest rate than the initial boom. Mason had built a reputation for breeding and training the finest horses in Montana, while Julia managed the business affairs with a keen mind for detail. Their home was filled with the laughter of children: 4-year-old John, named after Julia's father, and 2-year-old Mary, who bore her grandmother's name. A third child was expected before winter, and Mason secretly hoped for a daughter who would have Julia's auburn hair and spirit. The scars of the past remained. Julia still woke occasionally from nightmares of fire and loss, and Mason's shoulder ached in bad weather, a permanent reminder of the bullet he'd taken to save her. But these were overshadowed by the life they had built together, by the love that had grown from that first desperate night when he had wrapped her in his coat and promised to keep her safe. On a crisp autumn afternoon, much like the day they had first met, Mason returned from town to find Julia sitting on the porch swing, watching the children play in the yard. John was attempting to lasso a wooden post under the watchful eye of their ranch hand, while Mary toddled after a butterfly, her dark curls bouncing with each step. Mason dismounted, securing his horse to the hitching post before climbing the porch steps. Julia greeted him with a smile that still took his breath away, even after all these years. "How was town?" she asked as he settled beside her on the swing. "Busy. Freight wagons came in from Helena, got the supplies you wanted." He reached into his saddlebag and produced a small package wrapped in brown paper. "And something extra." Julia raised an eyebrow, accepting the package with curious fingers. As she unwrapped it, her expression softened. Inside was a small silver music box, intricately engraved with wildflowers. "Mason," she breathed, opening the lid. A familiar melody began to play, the same tune as her mother's music box, which now sat restored on their mantelpiece. "It's beautiful. Saw it at the new mercantile," he explained. "Thought you might like it for Mary when she's older." A tradition to pass down, Julia leaned against him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Sometimes I can't believe how fortunate I am," she said quietly, "to have found you, to have all this." Mason understood what went unsaid, that their happiness had been born from tragedy, that the life they cherished had risen from ashes. It was something they acknowledged without dwelling upon, a recognition that joy and sorrow were often intertwined. "Got some news in town," he said, changing the subject. "Judge sentenced the last of Maddox's men yesterday, 20 years hard labor." Julia nodded, satisfaction in her expression. Victor Maddox himself had been hanged 3 years prior, his empire divided and sold to smaller ranchers who had once lived in fear of him. Justice had been slow but thorough. "Sheriff Brady's retiring next month," Mason continued. "Town council asked if I'd consider running for the position." This caught Julia by surprise. She turned to face him fully. "You, as sheriff," Mason shrugged, somewhat self-conscious, "said they wanted someone honest, someone who'd stand against men like Maddox." He looked out at their children playing in the yard. "Told them I'd think about it." Julia studied him thoughtfully. You'd be good at it, you know. You've always protected those who need it. It would mean more time in town, less here with you and the children. We'd manage." She took his hand, her fingers tracing the calluses earned from years of working with horses. "The ranch is running smoothly. We have good people working for us now." Mason considered her words. The idea of serving as sheriff hadn't appealed to him at first, but the more he thought about it, the more he saw the value in it. Perhaps he could help ensure that what happened to Julia's family never happened to anyone else in Pinewood Creek. "If you think I should," he said finally, "I'll consider it more seriously." Julia smiled, knowing her husband well enough to recognize that he had already made up his mind. "I think you'd make this community proud, Sheriff Alden." The title sounded strange but not unpleasant. Mason leaned in to kiss her gently, still marveling that this extraordinary woman had become his wife, the mother of his children, the partner in all his endeavors. Their moment was interrupted by excited shouts from the yard. John had successfully lassoed the post and was calling for them to witness his achievement. Mary, not to be outdone, was attempting to climb onto the bottom rail of the corral fence. "Mary Elizabeth Alden, you get down from there this instant," Julia called, rising from the swing. Her authoritative tone was belied by the pride in her eyes as she watched her fearless daughter. Mason chuckled, following Julia down the porch steps. "Wonder where she gets that stubborn streak." Julia shot him a look of mock offense. "Clearly from your side of the family." Together they crossed the yard to their children, Mason lifting Mary into his arms while Julia praised John's roping skills. The sun was beginning to set behind the mountains, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple, the same colors that had filled the horizon on the night their story began. Later that evening, after the children were asleep, Mason and Julia sat together on the porch, wrapped in the very same coat he had placed around her shoulders 5 years ago. Though worn and mended in places, Mason had refused to replace it, and Julia understood why. It was more than just a garment, it was a symbol of the moment their lives had intertwined, of the promise he had made and kept. "You ever think about how differently things might have turned out?" Julia asked, her voice soft in the stillness. "If you hadn't seen the fire that night, if you hadn't come to investigate," Mason tightened his arm around her. "Sometimes. But then I look at you, at our children, at everything we've built together, and I know it couldn't have happened any other way." Julia nodded, understanding completely. Their love story had begun in fire and tragedy, but from those ashes had risen something enduring and beautiful. The coat that had once sheltered her from the cold now wrapped around them both, a reminder of how far they had come, and the promise they renewed each day to hold on to each other, no matter what storms might come. As stars appeared in the darkening sky, Mason Alden gazed at the woman beside him and silently thanked whatever fate or providence had led him to her that night. The cowboy who once valued solitude above all else now found his greatest joy in the family they had created together. And Julia, who had lost everything in a single night of violence, had discovered that the heart's capacity for love was limitless, that even from the darkest moments could come the brightest beginnings. The coat that had once been a shelter had become a symbol of their enduring love, a tangible reminder that sometimes the most precious things in life come from holding on when the world is telling you to let go.